Hi guys. For those of you guys who don't know, my name is Nikhil, and like Patrick said, the title of this presentation is called Perception. Let me kick this off with a story. So this story takes place in Ghana only hours after we hiked the Blue Waterfalls. It was a beautiful hike. It was very strenuous and very tiring. On the way back, we were all tired. We were soaking wet and just asleep. And we were taking the van back from the waterfalls to the city where we were staying, Hope. And after we got back, I took a taxi to an ATM with my two roommates, and we were going to withdraw some cash because we had spent what little we had left at the falls and on the taxi. It took me about 5 minutes of rummaging through my bag to realize that I had lost my wallet. And I just pulled it over in the van right over, so I thought I'd contact our van driver and immediately and just tell him what happened. And he told me that he'd look in the van, and he even invited me to come and look at the van wash place himself because he had taken the van to get washed. Later as I was going there, he called me and told me that there was indeed no wallet to be found. And because the van was being washed, I started to this is when panic really began to set in. When I arrived there, I noticed that there were about 8 young boys washing the van. All of them who were searching the van, I had concluded that one of them had to have taken the wallet. And I remember that I was really tired and really grumpy. And not only was I just super panicked at the time, I remember feeling just an unfounded anger towards pretty much everyone there. And that was weird. I remember putting on a show about how important that wallet was to me. I'm not entirely proud of it, but I made up an elaborate story about how the wallet contained some serious medical information about me, danger without it. And I really had no idea what else to do as far as trying to get my wallet back. So, long story short, eventually our scene over there began to attract a lot of people, and my two roommates pointed out to me that this was starting to get dangerous and we should probably get out of there before we cause an even bigger scene. And, none to my surprise and none to my pleasure, we left. And looking back, I remember very vividly seeing the faces of the young men and the taxi driver, our van driver. And on our van driver's face, I remember seeing just a petrified look filled with worry and stress. And on the young men, I saw mixed looks of worry and a little bit of smugness. But that didn't really concern me at the time. What did concern me was the fact that I didn't have my wallet, and I was convinced that one of those young men had it. I didn't have my wallet, and it contained, a lot of things important to me, from, your credit card and debit card, to things of also sentimental value, pictures of my family, pictures of friends that I've received, and things that were irreplaceable. So I was very keen on getting that wallet back. And losing that wallet wasn't just about losing a thing that carried, pictures and your cards and whatever, but it also was, losing that wallet meant something more to me, because when I lost it, I felt that I had lost the power that wallet gave me. That, because it had access to money and had access to it had proof of citizenship, that I felt very powerless and I felt very dependent without it. And I think that was part of the reason that seeing those faces at the time, full of panic, fear, didn't really make me feel guilty at all. At the time, I remember feeling very justified in how I felt and what I was doing. I remember feeling really, really cruel and incredibly malicious, wishing things on them that silently that I really don't think we should ever wish on people. And my intolerance then, and just the blatant, unwarranted malevolence that I was feeling towards those people, it was really scary to me. I never really thought I could look at someone and just perceive someone with such feeling over something as trivial as a wallet, no matter how much fake power and whatever it endowed me with. And that night kind of revealed something, a hidden side of myself to me. And it, above that, it made me afraid of myself. And it made me question the values and priorities I had. And more so, however, it made me question the way I perceive people and how do I view them the way I view them, and why do I view people the way I view them. Only later did I realize, that I come to an understanding about how I couldn't get my wallet back because getting a wallet back from one of those kids would have meant them being fired at the time, which was not less than ideal in the Ghanaian economy. I really, thinking about it, I harbor a lot of guilt when I think about that night. And the way I perceive people, it's been a very conscious and intentional battle for me. It's a constant struggle for me. It's really something I'd like to keep fighting for and working on in the future. So this presentation, as you guys can imagine by now, is all about the way I perceive people and how that's changed and why. So I'm going to be telling you guys a couple more stories about interactions with people and the way I perceive people and how I look at that now, me trying to dissect myself, I suppose. So in the first country we landed in on our gap year was Ghana, and then following that was Thailand. In Ghana, even though the official language was English, most people spoke Ewe, and they exclusively spoke Ewe, especially when you went to markets and wanted to interact with locals who weren't educated. You would have to speak in Ewe, which was weird to me because speaking to people who don't speak the same language as you can be frustrating, and as I later learned, very dangerous to the way you perceive people. And speaking Ewe in Ghana was really one of my first experiences in a foreign culture where I felt completely bare and unshielded by the comfort of being able to speak English, because usually when you travel, you go to somewhere where you can speak English with people and you feel that you can connect to people because of that. But that wasn't the case here. Being forced to interact with a culture where nobody speaks the language was very hard. I felt alienated and isolated. And in Thailand, even though it was the same situation, it was even much more intense actually in Thailand. Nobody, except for perhaps our language translator, our coordinator, PGUP, spoke English. So it was pretty much required to learn Thai, just to ask where the bathroom was and etc. And even though learning Thai and interacting with the Thai culture was much more mandatory, I felt it was at the same time much more optional, if that makes any sense. That's because in Ghana, after our time had come to an end and we were talking about our time there reminiscing, we reflected on our experiences, and I realized just how much opportunity we had been presented with and how much opportunity I felt that I had passed on because I refused to interact with culture, and because I couldn't understand the culture, I perceived it negatively, and that really hurt me. And in Thailand, even though that was the same case, I remember refusing to allow myself to pass on opportunities to look at anyone in anything less than the most positive way. And looking back on Thailand and looking back on Ghana, those two experiences were vastly different, and that was all because of not just the mentality I had going forward, but because of the way I was able to perceive them. And the difference in the reason for the difference in engagement, like I said, was perception. It was all about the way I perceived them, not about how they were, but how I perceived them. So I told you guys about a story where I was perceiving culture and people outside our group, but we've been traveling in a group full of 14 other people for 7 months, and that's a very intense experience. And this is a story about a TBB student who I did not harbor the best of feelings for at the start of the trip, but who now I love like a brother. And the student's name is John Reese. At the start of the trip, John definitely suffered from his social anxieties and ADHD, which made it hard for him to interact positively with the group, have positive interactions with the group. And I remember describing John as someone with whom I shared a lot of respect for, but at the same time, he was like, my interactions with him were like a thorn in my side. And I knew then that even if I did not address that, that thorn would simply grow in something much worse. Despite knowing that I didn't address that problem, whether it came from, the inhibition came from, bashfulness or just not knowing how to do so, actually. I remember thinking to myself, how can I call someone out on something that I don't view as, like, I view as unwarranted and something that I should be having to accommodate towards. And because I came to that conclusion, I simply didn't say anything and moved on. But me telling myself that I had to, conform to this and adapt to it was much easier said than done. And unfortunately, this sort of thorn became worse as our time progressed through Ghana, and it started boiling up, which caused me to associate negative feelings with John and regrettably look at, like, associate negative feelings with John. And even in times when I saw that he was suffering or he was sad or he needed help and I wanted to help him, I couldn't, or I didn't. And that was a very interesting and enlightening experience to me, because I felt that I had an objective understanding of the situation. I felt that even though it was very weird to me, because I had an objective understanding and I saw a solution that made perfect sense to me, yet I couldn't act on it because of something I felt and something that was unwarranted to me. Regardless, the feelings stayed and I was unable to create a relationship with John until we were put together as roommates in Thailand. And up until then, I felt trapped within myself because I couldn't act on what I felt I should do. And rooming with John taught me a lot, because it showed me how much we had in common. It showed me how capable he was. I saw how wise he was. He was kind, and ironically, he was very social with me when we were interacting. And that kind of change that really changed my perception. It was a very big shock to me. It was a cognitive dissonance, and it completely reversed the way I looked at him. It was an experience that John and my relationship to him was like a very experiential lesson, and it was a reminder to me about how perception can change over time and how people can't just be judged as one-sided or but only as multifaceted, and with consideration that we'll never get to know them completely. People are like an infinitely deep lake. You can swim around as much as you can, and you can understand a lot of the lake, but you'll never get to know the full thing. And keeping this in mind and never judging someone solely based off a single facet of their personality and being is what can prevent negative relationships and lost opportunities. Speaking of lost opportunities, this next story is about a relationship I've had with a TBB student, Isabel, and I view it as a lost opportunity because in contrast to my relationship with John, I got along very well with Isabel at the very start of this trip. And like any person and like in any relationship, the more you learn about a person, the more your perception of them is going to change. And as this was different because as I got to know Isabel better, I noticed that we were very different people. And I began to notice things that I didn't agree with, but more so, I just didn't understand. And we've had very different ways of looking at the world, ourselves, our environment, pretty much everything else. I didn't understand that, and that lack of understanding kind of led to a fixation of trying to understand and being confused every time. And because I was so fixated on those, which I slowly began to view as flaws because I didn't understand them, it blinded me to the rest of what I saw in Isabel. And this cycle of slowly only perceiving one part of her over and over again, and that slowly blinded me more. Really, I'll get to that in a second, actually. I had a hard time accepting what I saw, understanding what I saw, but worst of all, it was very easy for me to validate what I saw. And this cycle caused me to kind of want to, it made me close myself off completely to her. And I remember that not only closed me off to her, but I began to close myself off unwittingly to other people as well. And they began to close themselves off to me, which was another surprise and a little lesson perception because I didn't understand that. I didn't understand why, but my relationship with her was not separate from everyone else's. It was all connected, and I did not understand that at the time. It was only when I began to start reflecting on myself that I began to see my own capability for, how do I say it? My own capability for believing and viewing things the way Isabel is able to do so. And by being able to understand myself I was able to slowly start to understand Isabel. And after I started to understand, I was able to start to see more and more of her. And as I began to see more and more, what I noticed was what I at first defined as flaws turned into simply defining characteristics, and now what I view to be strengths in Isabel. So in the past, I've tended to take a more cynical view of people, and I still struggle with that. And that's for a lot of reasons. One, because it's like a mechanism. Keeping yourself shielded off and cut off from other people stops you from being hurt. And taking an optimistic view of someone, while it does connect you towards them, it at the same time leaves you vulnerable, and that is scary. Because when you don't know what someone's going to do, and when you learn more about someone, when you learn something new about someone, it's uncertain, and that uncertainty was scary to me. And going back and forth, I would go back and forth on this trip on being cynical and being optimistic. My own uncertainty and insecurity in that was what would always send me back. And the reason I did this POL is because I wanted to view people differently. I wanted to understand the way I view people. And I want to be able to look at someone in a positive way if I want to, without inhibition. So the things that I learned in this were all the things I learned were the things I learned. And what that means is this was all about a presentation. This was a presentation about I learned. I'm not saying that it's true or not. I'm saying it's what I learned. I learned that people can't be described with single sweeping statements. They're multifaceted. Mindfulness of this alongside with the fact that you can never expect to know the entirety of a person helps to prevent the use and creation of those statements. Another thing I learned through a lot of hardship, trial and error, was that every relationship you pass on is a missed opportunity. That's not to say one should seek to create relationships wherever they go, but merely to never close yourself off to the possibility of a relationship. The next thing I learned was that perception of another's flaws, and only their flaws, is incredibly easy to validate. And that led to a cycle of continuous validation and perception until that's all one can see. It's blinding. Past relationships and experiences inevitably affect perception in the present. Awareness of this is incredibly important when you look at people, because you may judge them just based on what you see in yourself and what you see in the past, but you may never judge them by what you see in front of you. And that's bad. Perception of others is often undoubtedly connected to our perception of self. It is mutually exclusive. No two perceptions are mutually exclusive. The way we look at people is completely mutually inclusive. The way we look at ourselves is affected by the way we look at others. And the way we look at others is completely affected by the way we look at ourselves. And learning all of this has really been eye-opening. It's taught me a lot. So I'd like to apologize to Isabel for everything. And I would also like to say thank you for the learning experience. Thank you. Any questions?
I'm curious about your wallet.
My what?
Your wallet story.
Oh.
Did you ever find your
No, that was gone. It had everything, literally. It had my passport card, 2 credit cards, a debit card, bunch of cash, like bunch of rewards cards and everything, but I lost everything. Literally, that was like all my eggs in one basket. It's gone.
How did you deal with that?
Oh, that was for me. The major effect of that was just like a lack of trust in locals for a long time in poor countries. I really was to becoming very cynical in trusting them with or around anything, and I think that affected a lot of my relationships for a while. Yes.
I'll be very interested about how you feel when you come back to your community and to American culture, and see how perceptions are.
Yeah.
And because right now, it's a big deal.
I think the very first experience I had with this was when I came back. This is where I first began to seriously reflect and consider everything all at once. Was when first day we came back to the U.S. Nadir and I went to Starbucks, and a lady on the phone just comes up to us, seemed randomly, and asked me point blank on whether I was Indian or Muslim. And she, after I answered Indian, she proceeded to say certain things about the Muslim religion on her phone to her friend. And while that was infuriating to me, At the same time, I was surprised to see that I didn't judge her completely at the time. I simply looked at that as a part of herself, and I questioned to myself what must be causing that. And I asked myself, what am I missing? Instead of judging her completely.
As I was flying out here yesterday, I sat next to a man who had a beautiful accent, and it sounded kind of French. And I just quietly said, "Where are you from? You know, what country did your family come from?" And he was really threatened by that. And I meant it in a very friendly, warm, interested gesture because I love international people. And he was very concerned because he was from the Middle East and he never did come where he was from. So I was so threatening to him. And it didn't occur to me that to someone who isn't the privileged, as Johnny described it, which is so accurate, that I was a threat to him just because I wanted to know where he was from. So perceptions, you know, such a huge thing. Great topic that you brought up.
I'm sorry, but just for time's sake, I think now it's time to say thank you. Yeah.